Welcome back. As federal regulators have struggled to pinpoint the exact source and scope of the Cyclospora outbreak, sickening thousands, consumers have questions about how to tell if the produce at their store may be affected. And it's shedding light on how complicated the food supply chain can be. Professor Julie Swann, head of the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at NC State University, explains.
Professor Swan, we are talking about the food supply chain. Can you talk about all of the points along that chain that you can end up with some type of a contamination problem?
It's complicated because first you have where the lettuce grows, and then it may be processed, cut, bagged, put into different places. So you can have contamination occur at the farm, within the processing plant, distribution centers, several different places within that supply chain.
I know it can be difficult to then pinpoint where in the chain the problem is. So, how do you even begin that process of going backwards through the supply chain and figuring out where the issue is?
Well, it starts with the people and the infections that you know about, and you try to understand what kind of food they might have consumed. And in some cases, like the particular outbreak that we have now, it can incubate for up to a couple of weeks. So it could be something you ate yesterday, or it could be something you ate 2 weeks ago. In the Michigan cases, they have identified that lettuce from food chain is a potential culprit. So then they go back, and then they do have information that shows them where lettuce came from, which producers, distributors, and farms. But by the time they get to that point, the stuff has already gone through the system. So the actual lettuce that was there a couple of weeks ago is not there anymore, and the contaminant may not be there anymore. But they can get a good idea of where it comes from, at least a pretty good idea.
So, when we talk about a recall, how do they determine how big a recall needs to be or how long it needs to go? And if there were like frozen things that were packaged that could be affected, how do they figure out what is still on the shelf that could be a a health risk?
Well, so when they do that looking back and at the supply chain, in this case, you could imagine even just one head of lettuce was contaminated and went into the processing plant. But one head of lettuce can spread because something gets onto the machinery and then it goes into other packages. So that's why there is a recall both on some things that are in fast food restaurants and in some grocery stores on packaged lettuces. But they do have the time period that's associated with people getting sick and what they ate. And then they shut down the plant and clean the equipment and all of those kinds of things. I think one of the questions is whether it was limited to just lettuce from a particular farm or whether it was wider than that. And right now, I don't think that we know that answer, but many of the cases are pointing to lettuce as a culprit this time.
And I know that sometimes we have things that come from the same farm that were branded or marketed under different names. So, can you talk about that point in the supply chain? And as a consumer, is there anything you can do to trace that backwards yourself and figure out the source of where that food is coming from?
It would be pretty hard for a consumer to trace back a bag of packaged lettuce at a store all the way back to the sources. And it might even have products from more than one farm contained in there. Just imagine there are different kinds of lettuces in those bags. So that part is more difficult doing that direct link. But what you can say is that when you're looking at things like a whole head of lettuce as compared to chopped mixed lettuces, the risk is lower because there's a little bit more certainty that that one head of lettuce is not going to be contaminated by the processing and the equipment associated with others. And you can remove the outer layer. So there are some things that people can do to increase safety. And we do have foodborne illnesses periodically, different kinds. This one is a little bit different and it's bigger than we've seen in recent time periods. But I think that there are some things that we can consider in general. Going for whole food typically is better than going for bags of packaged lettuce. They have been involved in other outbreaks before.